Good afternoon. All of us want to be freed of pain and misery and not experience any problems. But as we know from our experiences in our daily life, so many of our difficulties and problems come about through errors that we make, through not understanding reality. And this is certainly the case in our daily life, and it's the case at a far more fundamental level. For example, not understanding how our physical mental aggregates exist in reality. Our self, this appears to us like all phenomena, appears to us as if it is truly existent, and then our consciousness innately grasps at it as existing in the way that it appears. And it's from this misapprehension of reality that all our other afflictions and problems come for ourselves and others. Every phenomenon appears to us as being independent, not requiring or even influenced by causes or imputation by mind. This is the case for our self, our aggregates, and every object of thought. Here we need to first recognize how phenomena appear to us, and then ask the straightforward question: is this appearance in accordance with reality or not? Does the phenomenon, or to express it differently, does the phenomenon exist in the way that it appears or not? And this we need to apply to all phenomena, most importantly, the self and the physical and mental aggregates. And when we investigate, we'll come to see that no phenomenon that appears to us exists in the way that it appears. Not at all, not even a tiny amount. But that doesn't mean that phenomena don't exist entirely, rather they exist as a mere imputation by mind. And in terms of our self, what is our sense of self imputed onto? It's imputed onto any of the aggregates. And this is how the self exists in reality. It exists as a mere imputation by mind onto the aggregates.
那那信息能过的那信息对呢去有为呢那就怕大家这着急肯定去那是有实际的能够说的但怕大家着急咱们的去的通过嘛我是觉得去没法通过的但是碰他人不能带的没去的去嘛能过的肯定去度上街上度什么上了的上了的有把那怕接把接着的咱们的去的没法通过的这上在没去的去那些原来去有个人呢我就怕大家着急咱们的你去问有个通过过的你同样一次了去的没法通过还是别的这上的那张没去的去那些原来去有嘛的现在没去那些去路什么这边落的落些的是那地方就别的些你那些那这个那在那的那落的那的刚来嘛的让我们的这个能够多还是比就是那些有的什么什么的没去去这个往些的几块的和推些的是因为你们在改了那你那些都我们都接不接起来怕别干啥那么接不接多了可不了刚来嘛的让我们的这个东上的都过来东一多还是现在让我们的这个那些让我们的这个通过民族故事现在让我们的这个马桶而且第一差不了东北东一多还是那一张刚来嘛就让我们的这个那里落地那落有的那些的那有的是这边落地落些也是看看什么在里边写着的地
This morning we covered the verses from Nagarjuna's Precious Garland, where the illustration of mirage was presented. So just to say here, from the translator side, before I continue with what Genla said, there was an error in my translation, but by the time the video is uploaded, the text will have been corrected, and every fortnight Andy updates the text online with the changes in the translation, so you can always download it, and if you download it now, it will have the correct translation in there already. So to go back to what Geshe has just said, so this morning, speaking about a mirage, the illustration for Nagarjuna was one of a mirage. And the illustration is, as we know with the mirage, in the distance, one sees a clear body of water shimmering. And that is what appears to our mind, is a body of water. This is what appears to us. But we know that when we approach that body of water, disappears. If that water existed in the way that it appeared, we would find it. But we do not. In fact, it disappears. As we saw in the illustration in the verses, if that body of water were not a mirage, but were a body of water, as we approach it, it should become ever clearer. But instead it disappears. And this then is an analogy that the phenomenon does not exist in the way that it appears. It's empty of existing in the way that it appears. And the consciousness that apprehended that phenomenon, this body of water, as existing in the way that it appears, was a wrong consciousness. And how do we know that? By investigating. In this case, investigation is straightforward. One approaches and we find the body of water disappears. It's empty of existing in the way that it appears. And that previous consciousness that apprehended the body of water as existing in the way that it appears, we know with certainty was a wrong consciousness. Similarly, Narayabhi, when they investigate any phenomenon, for example the self, they come to recognize that it does not exist in the way that it appears, and they realize emptiness directly. And this realization, this direct realization of emptiness, this consciousness is entirely in accordance with reality. Post-meditation, Arya being recognizes that the all other consciousnesses that apprehend phenomena to exist in the way they appear, all other consciousnesses are wrong. It's this consciousness, the wisdom directly realizing emptiness, that is in accordance with reality. So that is, in brief, what we discussed this morning.
Alright, now I'm going to Bendigo, the Gorsheba. That Bendigo is not the Mason Shady. Then I'm Lolaya, the Niki Gasa said to Lord Night, Galama Dramun to Nengores. Just a non-nation doom, look, and this Jebachin, some of us don't go to say, those Jebachin, Gala, Jebachin, some Tana, some board in the mind.
That's what we covered then this morning. Now we'll continue in the text. We at the bottom of page 10, and here we now engage in the searching for the self, and in particular we will look at the way of thinking that we need to apply in our meditation to investigate, to see whether the self exists in the way that it appears, whether it is truly existent or not. So that's what we're going to come to now.
That shares some but that is the Casan, shares some Casan, that Berna, so that on the bed, the Bachevach, Pitch, the Shach to Chevachevina, Anzolia, Joan Bindam, the Yu, she judging Sambana, the Yu could be Guesiki, Bishi, Sharan, the Shan Lola Chaya, she's an Anzuki, and this one.
To present an example, when it is said and thought that human beings should have happiness, a human being appears boldly to our mind.
Dene lava de Gabla, and then Manjuke, the Hugo Midi, and the Lolia can do Chishmichavena, and then Midi, the Hugo said Midi, Shang days, Kala Matuba, Horan Chipu, Kala Rang many Udi by Joji, Loli Chago, Shang de Lola Chaya, Charles.
As when we hear, as we often do in teachings, on our own in meditation, that all beings only want happiness. That mere thought then leads to a human or a person appearing boldly to our mind. Here, we immediately now, in our meditation, how does the human or person appear to the mind? Well, the meaning of this term, boldly, is the person appears as being truly existent, as being independent, not requiring anything, not requiring imputation, and so forth. The person appears in a way as very solid, almost as if one could reach out and hold the person, or touch the person.
And dinner said, Naduma, who may say, I wanted that child to send some time. Now said, Lolia can check to. Then I do he, my day, my leg said, and do some time, Gabla. Now said, Lolia can check to. Do see him show us. Shinju Gabla, and do the garden lesson. My diggy who is some time. I said, now the Pumbodia make, send the make, Pumbo that same color, Maduba, Coron, and the chicken, Coron, many, Rosso Yeti, the Pumbo send the Joa Medica, and the Coron, Rosso took the chicken, and the Chichash, Lolia, Shago, that's. There's a D, Shayadi, the Matubanata, is what.
When we hear the sentence, human beings should have happiness, a human appears to our mind, of course we take this very widely. The thought of, I want happiness, all beings want happiness, I want to be freed from suffering, or I am sitting, I am listening, I am working. So how does the self appear when we think like this? And we're looking at the self because the self is the center of so many thoughts. Whether most things, what we're thinking about, directly or indirectly, the self is present. So how does that self appear to us? We see that it appears as if it is independent. Independence of the aggregates, for example. Different from or separate from the aggregates. Not requiring the aggregates. And this is the meaning of the term true existence. That the self appears to be independent. Not influenced by or requiring, for example, the aggregates. The self, like all phenomena, appear to our mind as being truly existent. So in the case of the self, we say that it appears separate or different apart from the aggregates, which means the body won't have any impact on our self. The mental aggregates have no impact on the self. It's completely independent. So this is how phenomena, such as the self, appear to us. And again, I quoted a verse from the Bodhisattva's Way of Life, of which the meaning is that without vividly recognizing the object of negation, inherent existence, that object of negation cannot be eliminated. And if one cannot eliminate the object of negation, how can one realize emptiness? It's impossible to realize emptiness. On the other hand, when one comes to vividly recognize the object to be negated or the object to be refuted, inherent existence, then one can realize its non-existence. Then one can negate it, refute it, and realize its non-existence, and thereby realize emptiness. So the starting point of recognizing the object of negation is essential. When you think, I want happiness, I want to be free from pain and misery, you look at how our sense of self appears there, and it appears independent, not influenced by causes or imputation by mind, and if not impacted by imputation by mind, it's not impacted by the mental aggregates, and it's not also impacted by the physical aggregates. This is the meaning of the self appears as being independent. It also appears as if it's unchanging, something really solid. And that is the meaning also of boldly. So you could say it appears to be as if it's solid or bold. Now then, the text turns to having recognized the object of negation, how to engage in the meditation. In the second sentence, to create human happiness, one must achieve the favorable circumstances for physical pleasures, such as food, clothing, shelter, medicines, and transportation for the body.
Digi Judu Gala Canis Trubores and Digi Judu Canis Trubore, then Midi Digi Soa, said Digi Judu Sura, Jazan Lula, Dobo, or Kalasaya, Kalashsa, and Zubulia Digi Trualia, Kalasa, and then Gueru, said, Dulo, Guenje, Digi Truata, Kalasa, Mili Digi Truata. Didn't do any, just a comba, didn't Chavada, didn't Maya, didn't do a second comba, and dig it on a digituya, and just main churches, Lula, Casanazzi, main churches, and digituya, and the other parcel, Sajikiwo, down parcel, didn't parcel to air and riches, do she digituya. Chazan digitugala. As Lula didn't dig it to touch and seven didn't dig it to tiny war, as the Lula didn't dig it to the country wasn't Lula Dochesaya, and a Dulokoya, Dosakamba, Lula Menchia, and pass on Manzuki, Dusinetim British Campion Ladiniki, such a water they tried them, so part of Suzuki, and the Lagatea, the motion of Tuya, the Niche and Manzuki dig it to Borovas, just as I want to teach us, Lula Padu was the Lula Tuyin Judge, and the dig it to us.
First half of the sentence, in answer to the question, to create, or the statement, to create human happiness, firstly, one needs to take care, or we need to take care of our basic physical needs. We need to take care of our body. Our body requires nutritious food that sustains our body, helps keep us healthy. We need clothing to protect us from the elements. We need shelter also to protect us from the elements, medicine to keep us healthy, and transportation so that we can go on holiday, we can meet our friends and so forth. So we need to take care of our body to ensure that we have the basic necessities to support our life.
Said no to Galas, Umbo, the Ludan, Java Medic, Dealer Rosso, Java Medic, Coromon to Bachin to us. Dina Shinjik, whenever Dina Shin now, Nashin didn't guide in the Yovaina, Ludan, Java Guinea Medic, and Coram when you Corom Rosso to United in the Yovaina, and the Pumbo Ludelia, Dulo, Grand Cat, Lulu, Dulo, Grand, and then Lulu Kalasa. And the Chigulu major share the Juno cover guiding Nasa, Nadilla, Digi Yontu Mares. Carasaponi Jame Dunshed was Jame Dunshed, Jawakuni Medic, Jason Jawakuni Medic, Pumpola, the Negation, Su Pumpola, the Negi, Duschine, Tuyun Dubu, and the consumers. There's happened another Jawamedic, Mini Vena, Michi, Chu Cardi, Michela. Michi Chaya, Toya, the Kama Michela, and the Kalasa, Dulo Combina, and then Michi Budile, Pascal. Lord, says the last one you tell, Jamin Shed was Jawamia, and Dinashi is Dinashi, Jazam, Lula, and Dulo Goyana, says Sayana, Dunia, Menjia, Pass Lulu, Pass Chimuchi Kabla, and Nala, Diki, to say. Can this do good to get you by Garson? Nasa, Gala, but Ramu to Juba, Pumbo did a rosso, more Talibachi, or rosso to do. Negua. Did now one Ashi did the Yovaina, Pumbo did the Maran, Jamie to Shen Chabode, Jamie to Shena, and Lula did you to get in the two to do, neither did you move to us, Yumares. Jeza, and Yungo Mares, did Jamie to Shena, the Yumares.
This first part of the sentence may seem quite obvious, and maybe it's not so apparent its connection here. But we heard in the very first sentence in this paragraph that the self, like all phenomena, appears as if it is independent. If the self existed independently and wanted happiness, if it were independent of the body would have no impact on the self. Because they're independent, they're unconnected, they're different or separate. But we recognize here, from this obvious truth, that for happiness, we need to achieve the favorable circumstances for the physical pleasures, such as food, clothing, shelter, medicine, and transportation. These do lead to happiness, despite their having the impact on the body and the self appearing as if it has no connections, independent of the body. If the self were independent of the body, then eating delicious food, being warm in cold weather or cool in hot weather, would have no impact on our feeling of happiness, would have no impact on the self. But we know that's not the case. For example, two separate people, their bodies are not connected. If one is hungry, the other, eating, will not satiate the hungry person. If one is cold, should the other put on warm clothing, the first person will not be warmed. So there we see that two bodies are separate, and those selves in that way are separate. But for ourselves, whilst the self appears to us as being independent of our body, the self to experience happiness, clearly there is a relationship with the body. The self that appears as if it is unconnected, has no relationship with the body, for example, or anything at all, appears independent and truly existent, already in this sentence we can recognize intellectually, based on our own experience, that this is not the case. We know we require favorable physical circumstances for happiness. We seek them out. We enjoy it. We enjoy having them. So we can clearly recognize from this illustration on our own experience that there is a relationship between the self experiencing happiness and our physical aggregate, our body. There is a relationship, a connection. Or to express it in a way we're more familiar with, there is a dependency between the self and the body. And this is despite the self appearing as being independent. Therefore, the self cannot exist in the way that it appears. It cannot exist free of relationship or connection or having no dependency with anything. It cannot be this unchanging, independent entity. Clearly, there is a relationship between the self and the body, a dependency between the self and the physical aggregate.
当然，内心这个那就来那蓬勃的生了，刚对我们人们的这个那兴趣越为呢，蓬勃的那个前进这边跟俺的第一个嘛嘞，就是啊，那在俺的蓬勃的前进这边的嘛，从哪里啊？第一个我把那个是好过多啊，今天在俺是那兴趣蓬勃的对的这边吧，去把这些事情这些些的，当然就生了的呢，就是生了的呢的。对为呢，生了大为结为那样，就俺的这个那些刚才嘛多人们这个要嘛的是，在这点嘛的的，生了先也了，牺牲把配所以生地位推进主的，都主的，女性你个语言，米的这个所关那事情。
What's seen in the first part of the sentence then, that the self, despite appearing as being independent, and therefore nothing can impact on it, is clearly dependent. Because if the self were independent from the body, whatever happened to the body would have no impact on the self. Eating delicious food would bring no happiness. Eating awful food would bring no unhappiness. So clearly, despite appearing as being independent, the self cannot exist in the way that it appears. It has a relationship of dependency with the physical aggregate. And now the sentence continues, but to the mental aggregates. And the favorable circumstances for mental pleasures such as education, respectability, good disposition and tranquility of the mind, it is necessary to create a human's happiness through physical and mental pleasures.
Lobsang Dorje sempre sempre xie ya hu yue de, ma ji su su ge lo de bo la shun bo wa, xie me na de xie me de se sem ba ji ba la shu, ma zu Lobsang Dorje xie ni ya wo xian song ya se de di ji zhu de, ji zang ma se de di ji zhu ye chen jian ga de mo se sempre xie yuan xin ya jia ya, ani ya jie ya, ani me xi ya rab se de ya rab se xie li ya, an ji ge ga ma de ba bi ma zu se me de 判不出来的这些的话，压到他，那西上是玉的上坡，给你呢，下来本讲嘛的，这边上坡路去的那个讲呀的，那八撇坡，所以生漂流的是也八撇坡生漂流，那这个就像我们说牛毛像我的马上生漂流有吧？第那个月份那样子的生的第几些的，第几月一个切建筑切过，第那月份那样子生的第几个毛来着。 就在那里上，当然这个什么生活节的，怕是什么生活节，现在生活节的，没现在呢，我说的生活节，那上说说什么漂亮的给我，什么漂亮吃过，什么给我么，也拉介绍的那些什么给我么的些，就在那里上，当然这什么给我的，当然这个那个生命团的，那上大的说说的给我么，我当然是给我要，俺给我都是落了吧，就啥呢？以前俺就俺的能源都干了，可能是能过了，现在落了能源啊，现在。 蓬勃当sem个行业把这人们的这个老鼠绝不那会能过来，你那往哪星期，大家住的那的那去住的话，有原因呢？sem当俺的这边对象差的多是，实际上这边对象差的话呢，就要跟你没看结果了。关键这外面呢，俺sem里地区要对，俺的地区要要嘛的是，可是内心也蛮密的结果是吧？ 就是什么地区用的，什么地区的什么生活节啊，亚拉介绍这个这个地区主要这个经济吃点地区，俺这个地区用要可是什么当俺有的这边对象的话是，实际上当俺说什么的呢有的，年底下的地区用嘛，可是什么当俺有的这边对象，那往哪些主要为呢？俺这边对象吃过什么地区主要的，俺这个地区用嘛的是。
And so the first part of the sentence, we can recognize that having these favorable circumstances, mental pleasure, education, respectability, a good disposition, and tranquility of the mind, we will be happy. Because if one is educated, or the greater one's education, the more knowledge one has, in general, the less problems and difficulties one may have, the more skills that one has, the less problems and difficulties that one will have. And in terms of respectability and good disposition, to the extent that one has such a personality, one will have less interpersonal problems with others. Our interactions with others will be peaceful and harmonious. And similarly with tranquility of the mind. This is having a peaceful state of mind, a state of mind that is not readily disturbed, that is not easily disturbed or readily enraged. It's quite clear that a person who has these good qualities will be a happy person. And we know from our own position, our own experience, that when we are in such a mental state, we will readily answer a question saying, I am happy. And if our self existed in the way that it appeared, as if it is independent, having, for example, no connection with our mental aggregates, then whether we had a good disposition, a tranquil mind, or an education, it would have no impact. It would have no impact at all on our happiness. The entire situation, our mental situation, would have no impact on our mental happiness or unhappiness. And then how would we be able to say with any basis, oh, I'm happy, things are going well, if our mental state had no relationship with our sense of self? So here too, we can see that despite the self appearing as independent, clearly it is dependent on our mental aggregates. Again, despite our self appearing to have no connection with anything at all, it has a connection, close relationship, a dependency with our mental aggregates.
Andu simji chidu kabla, chesa ngana zu semje tunyin da denegi chidu kabla, chesa nga set lo na shinji yoba ina nga dele digi ngo wares. Chesa da ngana zu sem digi sem la denegi tunyin yudu kabla, nga digu tu se atik nga zu hawu wares. Chesa dene za gar digi je gar shingol de dingol sana nga se atik rala na shulo na kala ma de Ram sem duida sem mado gang mado ram mune tubat meva sa ta karitin gorse sem dui na sadi sem la dui tubachi sem la dui tubachi au dui tubachi gore person sem la sabachi ya an sem ba bu yuri na de di yungo ba de yo ba za an na sadi sem la dui yuri ba yes.
So from these two segments, we can readily recognize, so from these, reflecting on these two segments here, having initially, as in the preceding sentence, come to recognize how the self appears, we can see that the self cannot exist in the way that it appears. It appears to be independent. And here we've just seen in the second segment of the sentence that the self clearly has a relationship of dependency with the mind. The mind has a very clear and obvious impact on ourself, on our sense of self. We know this from our own experience. We know from our own experience that there is a relationship of dependency, a connection, a relationship between the mind and the body and the mind, the self and the body, and the self and the mind. And therefore, the self cannot exist in the way that it appears. It cannot exist independently, but rather is dependent. And we know this from our own experience. For example, when our mind is open and spacious, we are happy. Not only are we happy, but we can move through life with very few difficulties. Here again we see the impact and the relationship between our mind, and our self. First, at the bullet point on the top of page 11, that being so, if we search, wondering what the real human is, we find that their body and mind individually are not the human, and there is also no human separate from these two.
Sem da lui dile shemi loso mich duelana de jinga na du kabla ane nga midi a sedi sem da lui de loso nengo na kala ma de loso yu nengo de ne na shinji lui dile loso message yo mare sem dile loso message jeme teshe midi sem de da jawa me de ge midi bidu lui da jeme teshe loso midi c'est ça donc c'est tenir l'autre chaîne l'autre ya midi il va être mis sur ma laisse. I'll read the bullet point again. That being so, if we search, wondering what the real human is, we find that their body and mind individually are not the human, and there is also no human separate from these two. The start of the meditation, at the outset, we came to see how our sense of self appears to us, which is, as we've heard, independent, without any relationship of dependency with anything at all, causes imputation by mind, the body, the mental aggregates, appears unconnected, unrelated to anything at all. But if we search for such a self, no such self can be found. The self does not, therefore, exist in the way that it appears, or the person, the word here is person, the person does not exist in the way that it appears. The person is not the body, nor is the person the mind. The person cannot, which means the person cannot be found in the body, nor can it be found in the mind, nor separate from these. So no matter how strongly we may identify with our body or our body parts, the person is not the body. Similarly, no matter how strongly we may associate with our mind, with our personality, or any aspect of our mind, the person is not the personality or the mind or any particular mind. But also, the person is not, so not only can the person not be found in the body or in the mind, the person is not unrelated to the body or the mind. It's not separate, independent from the body or mind. Therefore, the person does not exist in the way that it appears as being independent. But there is a relationship of dependency between the person and the body and the mind, but nevertheless, the person cannot be found in the body nor the mind. same day share about just not say the meditation check just Lydia Mamare, me Lydia Mamare, me same day Mamare, as it when I share. Then you continue the discussion.
I want to emphasize because it's I want to emphasize this point because it's of great importance. The person is a non-associated compound phenomena. And no matter how closely we identify with our body or any part of our body, the person cannot be found there because the person is not form. Similarly, no matter how strongly we associate with our personality or any aspect of our personality, in other words, with the mind, the person is not consciousness. And we recognize this because the person cannot be found amongst any of our consciousnesses either.
Marwa, the Shigasm, me reading a Marella, Dinashing Ma said, me reading the Vesna Marwa. Jazan Ma said, me same Vesna Marwa. Jazan Nadi, me read a semi Rosu Yorwa. Thinking Nala, Dinny shadow Rosu be my even make some doa. Jazan Chidana to some that Ma said, same Vesna Mare, Ludi Vesni, Ludi Vesna Mare. Never said, Ma said, may you can send the lawsuit to do it. Chidam Chidam Josna, and he said, Ma said, may you Marwa. Chidam Ma said, may send Marwa. Man said, Ma said, Maran, you can send the lawsuit Yore.
What's the something?
You something to me when you are Yore said. Ma said, 결혼 세대 결혼 류마로 하자. 결혼세대 결혼세 마로 하자. 제상 결혼 기세 류다 세미를 로스 두아. 제상 지단의 마세대 그 마세대 말하는 류디야 말에 마세대 말하는 셈디야 말에 제상 마세대 말하는 류다 세미를 로스 열베스 열에. 이제서 다다로를 잘해. 나
서바하고는 데니케란다를
Intuitively, we is Shiva. Then your is we Shiva. Elidian Geshe, and Mega Lusana, Ma said, I do the mares. Ma said, I send mares. My answer, Ma said, I do the same the Rosu Yore, your mares, Rosu Yore is
So what I've hopefully presented clearly is this part of the bullet point. We find that the body and mind individually are not the human. So this is one way to express it, but what it means is we are not our body. We are not any part of our body. Therefore, identifying with our body is mistaken. Identifying as our body, the self being the body, is mistaken. Likewise with the mind. Identifying the self as being the personality or an individual mind or the collection of varying minds, no self can be found there. We are not our mind either. But then, the self has to be something different then, surely. If the self is not the body, nor the mind, it must be something different then from the body or mind. In fact, in reality, we are something different. The self is something different from the body and the mind. The self is not the body, it's not the mind, but in reality, it is something different or separate from the body and mind.
Then that person Denile Shendo Rosu Midi Imba Me Sumba. Denile se Denile Garza Luda Sem. Denile Rosu Midi Ingenci Yomares Sumba. Mega near Galasne, Missy Sem Rang Luda, Sem Rosu Midi Yores, Rosu Yores, Chesara. That person Nala Garson was mi se di lui dan sem ni de le xian de lo su mi di ba yo ma le su
Så ikke til, der er det, der er bare det, jeg har været tænkt her.
det tingene de du ser det var det.
So again, the self in reality does exist as something different from the body and mind. Now turning to the text, and there is also no human separate or different from these two.
Dili tsik dagaran samdaba na karaswasne tsik dili daga samdaba na phumbo na se de phumbo da sem be shenba michiyo ma se to da tsik dili diro chi ko do nina danda di mare danda karsugo se ne deni le shen do rosu me se de jinye ma sheba na je na se di phumbo da sem na ma de fa koron mo ni tu de rosu chi ma le se mo danda di se mo 마도 풍 셈 미시 나세디 풍보다 셈을 로서 요 말에 순고 말에 셈을 로서 요래 말서 요래 셈이 풍보디 나디 풍보다 셈을 로서 요래 말에서 요래 했지 니기가 순고로서는 로서 요 말에 미고 요 말에 세디 나세디 풍보다 셈을 마되바 라는 뭐는 주디 현기 풍보다 셈을 마되바제 로서 주디 현지 요래 배서 이요 말에서 donde discutir.
So what I've said is clearly contrary to the text. So hence the need to understand the words. So the meaning of the words is as we see in the text. We find that being so, if we search, wondering what the real human is, we find their body and mind individually are not the human, and there is also no human separate from these two. So what that means is there's no human who is not dependent on the body and mind. That is what the meaning is, because the person does exist in reality separately from the body and mind. The meaning of what has been composed here is that there's no human that exists independently from these two, without any connection or relationship from these two, the body and mind. That is what the meaning of this clause is. Hence the need to gain teachings on the text to understand the meaning of the words well, and not just be content with the literal meaning, but to understand the deeper meaning. Because as this sentence states, the person is not their mind, the person is not the body. But then if we also say the person is not separate from these two, then it sounds like there is no person at all, the person doesn't exist. That's not the case. There is a self. But there is not a self that is independent, unconnected to the body and mind. To make sure this is clear then. The meaning is that, is there a person that is separate from the body and mind? We can say yes. But can we say that there's a person that is independent of the body and mind? Then we'd say no. So that is the meaning here.
지상은 저 대시 제바치 지거라 디교 소식인데 그래서 로를 낭수데 그래서 낭도 나와나 신도 제바치거라 봐. 제가 로를 낭도 풍부에 나와서 그래서 낭고스는 샘다 풍부라 마디오바 대나 제가 메디 마디오바 코로모에 주트스는 거로. 데니게 나와나 신가디 나와나 신지 나가디 내 풍부라 마디오바 지거르베 샘나 마디오바 지거르베스네 제가 샘다 풍부라 마디오베게 데레 로소 미세디 예야 말해서 디스는 받네.
We can understand this when we bear in mind the entire context. And we started out with in the very first part of this section, with coming to with the presentation on the need to identify the object of negation, how the self appears. Because this is what we are now analyzing, investigating. Does the self exist in the way that it appears? And the way that it appears is as being truly existent, which means to be independent. Independent of what? Everything at all. Nothing impacts on it. For example, the body and the mind. So, if we say, does the self exist within the body? No. Does the self exist within the mind? No. Does the self exist independent of the body and mind? No, it does not.
Bendigo now as Pumbota, send the Pumbo Kala and Badio, Coromoni, Judish, Meva Tumbo, don't such Tumbores. Indeed, don't sadi, they don't easy for the pass, don't easy for us. Cesada, Nakorongi, Rashin, Ganechi, Cesar, Kala and Badio Ramon in the tribute, don't be more Judish, yes, Cesar don't have don't sadi, don't have Paris. Then it is indeed. Dalai Badu Ramu to Nama, Shingi, Madu, Tombadi, Dingan, how Jebachi, to do by na, made to them about the 2 words, not to let the percent, made to donate about the Mama 2 words, since the do by na, Nag or on the Rashi, we need to how for hesitate.
The meditation starts out with coming to see vividly how the self appears, which is as if it is independent, something that is solid, that appears boldly to us, something that is not impacted by anything at all, such as the mind, in terms of, for example, imputation, or in terms of causes, or the body, and so forth. Then we investigate. Secondly, we investigate. Does the self exist in the way that it appears? Is the way the self appears in accordance with reality or not? And we investigate in the way that has been presented here, and we come to realize that the self cannot be found anywhere within the body or within an individual part or the body as an entirety. And therefore, identifying the body as the self is clearly mistaken. Similarly, we cannot find the person or the self within any of the individual minds or the collection of consciousness, cannot find it there at all. No matter how strongly we associate the person with the personality or an aspect of it, cannot be found there. So in this way, we come to realize that the self is empty of existing in the way that appears, independent of the body and mind. Here we come to realize emptiness, that the self is empty of existing in the way that it appears, empty of true existence. And this realization of emptiness is a realization of the ultimate truth. And this is a realization that is in accordance with reality. This realizing consciousness has realized how phenomena abide in reality.
the Mavaribes and Kadis and Nasia data, Kala, Ram, to don't much matter. Don't such and that the niggas some Nigo down with that. I said the Kadis do the Pumbo, Luda, similar dinner, Palu, similar dinner, Palu, Dabas and Yuva, such. Dinner how teachers are, Ma said the Pumbo, similar to the Dabas and Yuva, the Kunzu Cham was such. Is that the how.
So here one has realized that the self is empty of existing in the way that it appears. It's empty of true existence. But that doesn't mean the self doesn't exist at all. It's not non-existent. So that was the meaning of my statement, that the self does still exist. But how does it exist? Here we recognize that it exists merely as an imputation by mind. And this realization that the self exists merely as an imputation by mind is a realization of the subtle conventional truth. Here, through this analysis, one comes to realize the two truths.
And then I can your lamna, they don't worry, and I never marry yours. The guns your lamna, and the Pumbo reader similar to the Shabbat.
In summary, first one comes to recognize how the self appears boldly to one, we vividly need to recognize that it appears as if it is independent of our physical and mental aggregates, completely separate. However, following then the next step of the meditation, the analysis, seeking such a self, first in the physical aggregate, then the mental aggregates, and realizing cannot be found, and therefore does not exist in the way that it appears, we realize emptiness, the ultimate truth. Thereafter, the final step, we recognize the subtle conventional truth that the self does exist, but merely or only as an imputation by mind. Continuing in the text on page 11, similarly, when we meet an acquaintance named Tashi, we say, for instance, I saw Tashi, Tashi has aged, or Tashi has gained weight. Without analyzing or examining these statements, seeing Tashi's body and seeing it as frail and flabby is said to be seeing Tashi. Sorry, I forgot to turn on the microphone. So just in case that didn't come out, I was just reading the first 3 lines of the 3rd paragraph on page 11.
这些是不同的，这些同送噻的。这些就是跟我恰有不一样，或者就是跟我恰噻的。这些讲话了讲话或这些讲话恰都噻的。就如现在这个马达马街吧，这些有流通的，的规模现在我就是叫我恰的。旅也把它就是讲话恰了，说通话说，就那个几天的怕都是的西过了，得到有那个有话通了，都西过也行。
So this we know from our own daily life, that just from merely seeing someone's body, we say, I saw that person. So again, from seeing their physical aggregate, not necessarily even the entire physical aggregate, just seeing a part of it, we say, we saw that person. And we can say, their body has changed, they've aged, they've gained weight. But we don't say, their body has changed, they have gained weight. We rather say, Tashi has gained weight, or Tashi has aged. And so this is how we, in our daily life, this is how we interact. This is when we see someone's form aggregate, we believe we have seen the person, and when we see change in the form aggregate, we believe we have seen change in the person. What we know from what has been covered previously in this class is that if we were to say, if someone were to say, there's Tashi, and if we were to say to them, you're saying there's Tashi, based on what? Is Tashi his hand? Is this his arm? Is it just the part of the body that you saw perhaps as he was disappearing around a corner? Then you'd quickly come to recognize that you couldn't say you saw Tashi. All you saw were body parts. But without analysis, talking like this, as we do in our daily life, is not a lie. We are not trying to deceive anyone. And the consciousness that thinks in this way is not deceived. It's not a wrong consciousness. And that's presented in the next sentence. A consciousness that perceives such without analysis is not a wrong consciousness. And these statements also are not false. So again, this is how we go about our daily life, and this is not mistaken. The consciousness is not wrong. What we are doing is we are imputing the person onto the body. We are imputing Tashi onto his body. So then the next sentence. However, when analysis is done, a real Tashi himself, who is the possessor of the body, is not to be perceived, and his aging and becoming overweight also cannot stand up to analysis.
go Ludi Reves, and Geshe Reves, and go Lapa de Shiva, and go Lapa de Geshe Reves, and the Kamba de Geshe, and the Geshe, and the Kamba de Geshe, and the Kamba God Gasore, and Geshe said, and the Kamba, the Luda, the next Chasa Geshe, Res, Pashi Luce, none of the Lapa the Gay Lapa Res, Nine Legma, Kamba the Gay Kamba, Nine Legma, which is a Teresa, do Cheva, and Kurangi, Labadia, Tishi Duas, then the Cambodia, Tishi Duas, then the Bodia, Tishi Duas, then Tishi said the Koyores, Pacheva Cheva, and Kuran Lola Tishi said Neguas. Now, Nashin Tishi the Ganistu, Labadia, Marava, Cambodia, Rebidua, then the Chevena, Tishi said, do start and Chevena, and then Pumbodile, Losu, Pumbodile, Losu, and Tishi said, yeah, I say Pumbod. Pumbodile Matioba, the Matioba, Pumbola Matioba, Pumbodile Matioba, this is a loss to get yeah.
I'll read the sentence again. However, when analysis is done, a real Tashi himself, who is the possessor of the body, is not to be perceived, and is aging and becoming overweight, also cannot stand up to analysis. So here, as we saw in the previous part of the earlier part of this class, when one investigates, when one asks questions, analyzes, we will readily recognize that Tashi is not his body, is not a part of his body, is not his arm, is not his leg. And whatever part of the body we saw and call and label Tashi onto, that part of the body is not Tashi. And that is despite, if Tashi were to be asked, is that arm your arm? He would say, yes, it is. Just like we ourselves would say, this is my arm. So here, we ask ourselves, how did Tashi appear to us? And then through this process of analysis, we come to find he does not exist in the way that he appears. He does not exist independent or separate from his body, nor can he be found within it either. And if no Tashi independent can be found of the body, how can we say the person Tashi has got fat or has got old? How can we say that? Further, it is with respect to the decency or obnoxiousness of Tashi's mind whether Tashi is conventionally designated as a lovely or likable man, but Tashi's mind itself is not Tashi. So here, moving from the body to the mind. If Tashi existed in the way that he appeared as something independent of in this case, his mind, then there would be no relationship between his mind and Tashi. So how could we then say Tashi is decent or obnoxious? How could we say that if he were independent of his mind? But when we investigate within that consciousness of decency or obnoxiousness, we would not be able to find Tashi either. We could not find a Tashi that is within a consciousness that we could say is decent or lovely. Nor could we say the person Tashi is found within an obnoxious or an unlikable characteristic of his mind. So he cannot be found to be separate and unconnected, independent of his mind, nor within his mind.
Bendigo and the Geshe Thubten Rabten laws to Geshe Sambo Yore, a coin number, and the coin Yavare, who can watch the light. This is yeah, remember, that Geshe said, the Thubten Rabten begin Geshe said, remember, just that Bendigo said, Thubten Rabten begin Koran to Geshe said, the don't worries. It's not that Geshe the Ganesha, Geshe will Thubten similar to any to similar to any per Lupa, then a dinner, Lu Shabbat, the Jin said, shared the Jibba.
I hope that it's clear that what's being presented here in the context of Tashi is the self-same process as we looked at earlier. Just now, in relation to someone else, a person apart from ourselves or self other than ourselves. We see first how Tashi appears to us as being independent, truly existent, but if we investigate, we can find no truly existent Tashi within his body or within his mind. So not within a truly existent Tashi anywhere within his body and mind. But similarly, there is no Tashi who is no Tashi who is separate, unconnected to his body and mind. He is therefore empty of existing in the way that he appears to our mind. So just like ourselves, we do not exist in the way we appear to our mind, nor do other people exist in the way they appear to our mind. And in the same way, Tashi, being empty of existing in the way that he appears, so too are all his characteristics. For example, to say that he is a particular body part or a mental consciousness, this cannot be established, this cannot be found. So we come to the conclusion that Tashi is empty of existing in the way that he appears. Just like before though, we thereafter, after realizing the ultimate truth, recognize the subtle conventional truth, that Tashi is merely imputed by mind onto any one or several of his aggregates. Then the second bullet point. In brief, there is not the slightest part which is Tashi among the mere collection of Tashi's mind and body, his continuum, or individual parts. Therefore, dependent on just the collection of Tashi's body and mind, we merely designate Tashi.
Yasada di Yuna, Chashet, Tishi, Mare, Chisanda do Chicheva ina, and Tishi said to Signe Mares. Chisanda, Gandis Yore, Denigi, Gandis Yore, Sena, Denigi, Tishi said, Luna sent so what some that Pablo Tabat Yaba. Chisan, Angela Dondala, and Tishi said, Luna sent the audio for money to Mares. Chisan, Luna sent so what Tella, Pablo Tabat Yaba.
Hopefully then it's clear now when you read the summary that when we investigate, we come to recognize that Tashi, like all phenomena, do not exist in the way they appear. Tashi is not his body, is not his physical aggregate. He is also not his mental aggregates. He's also not completely separate from them. He's not individually any of his aggregates. He's not his particular body part, aged or overweight. Nor is he any particular consciousness, such as kind-hearted or obnoxious. And he's not the collection of these either. He's empty of existing in this way. However, he does exist, though, as a mere imputation by mind onto his body and or his mind.
Nang de nga se de che kan shi na nang du ka ka na bu su lo pa na du ga la ya ma du ran mo ni tu ba gran mo ni tu ba ne ko le ko mo ni tu tu shi ne ko le din na wa na shin che ba di nang su de ga la ya ma ran mo ni tu ba se de ni gi nang su di ran mo ni tu tu ji yo ba ina de ni chi le de ba tu ba la ko le de shi de ba tu ba da ra shi tu ba la ko le di ka cha de es se sa din na wa na ju yo le sin jin ba ina di jiba dile tensin siya lolo shi tensin shi maripa tensin maripa di chego les dine za dana du chi ne shim ju du chi shim cheba chi de ka ga la ya ma do rang mo ne ju tong ba di ka ne ju rang mo ne ju tong ba di do dam de passe de les do de passe de les za da dine gi nga du do na de ka na ma do tong ba di na ha go go wa da na di do na de ko to go le to go en za当这个结巴起这个了，可能是结巴起过来了。那就是当我落了把下趟的，都可能些个都拿些生态的可了，落了把下趟的生态，其实都是没有说的落了刚来把都刚碰波的，现在碰波刚来，然后我们这个那都是那个没有说的，你他结巴起这个了碰波了呀，第二些呢，地区出去买的朋友多，现在对的地区出去买的朋友多，介绍的。先的女的，看样就话没这个啊，让心主播的呢，让心主播的越不赢呢，但先的地区主要的，女的地区主要听你讲的，这个排要把它挖死。但我第三的这个就电力大型这边才能干啥的，刚才嘛就让我们主播拿完的，也把主播的意思，你拿完了有的是基本呢，你电信切过的意思。但这个那往那是能就这个东北的，它东一端的把这下过来是一点松下来。
And summarize what we've looked at this morning and now this afternoon is that all phenomena, every object of thought, everything we think about appears to us as being independent, existent by way of its own essence or existent by its own nature, inherently existent, truly existent. Every single phenomenon appears in this way. Then, if we investigate, though, to see if this appearance is in accordance with how the object exists, whether it's in accordance with reality or not, as we heard this morning, as we investigate, it should become ever clearer. Just like when one approaches a body of water, if that is a body of water, it should become ever clearer. But if it doesn't exist in the way that it appears, it will vanish, just like when one recognizes that a body of water is a mirage. So here we investigate to see if the object exists in the way that it appears, truly, inherently, by way of its own essence. This is the object of negation. This is what we are trying to eradicate. And we also thereafter recognize that the consciousness that innately grasps at phenomena as existing in the way that they appear. If the phenomenon is the self, it's called the ignorance of self-grasping, and it's an ignorance because it's not in accordance with reality. But to any other phenomenon, it's called the ignorance of true grasping. And when we recognize that no object exists truly by way of its own nature, we realize emptiness, and this is the ultimate truth.
Di toya le cheba chena di da di shin na she de cheba chena ka ni chibo re sin lu le de ne cheba chena sem le de ne cheba chena da di cheba chena ka re la ne che sa da ma na bi ka da na se de lu na sem chena ma de ba ko ro mo ni tu ba nen tu has na wa ne de ni na wa na chin ga ju ye ba yi na da ma le di gi ku du se di gi tu le lu le de bi ke se ko ye da de ni de ni di gi tu le ka na de le di gi yo ya du ka se ne lu da now I think I did that doing the table to check to us. Then I think similar digi to do, and then not let you have to person. Now I think I did similar table to check to us. Just like the names are Luda, Nasa, Luda, similar, Jamie, John meeting, Delage, to exchange, then George, meeting hormone to a Judy, you see the module of hormone to the Juven, Luda, similar to the digi to do, not digi. Lose. Just any member, now to do the digi to your Lula, Dogo, and Major, and Atisha, and assembly are checking the same somewhat that some digi to it, not a digi was. Just that now I'm not never Dalai shots, cousin, not do city to them, Lula, assembly, run on the Dugo and the Lucemla, and then 20 cherry, not a digi. So that the names are two children, two children, the now I'm not just that Master the consume, you can similar to the Juba, thereby Lu Shabbat, the shots. The New Yoga, Lu similar digi to Tunian Judge, Jayadu, Malatiki, more or less. The New Yoga, Master the consume another, who were similar to it, and Pablo Shabbat, who says, and then how away the other cousin at the shade that do not dish how occasion would do.
Thereafter, we looked at how to investigate to see if phenomena exist in the way they appeared. So the text presented the illustration of searching for the self in the body and the mind, and this is how one looks for the self to see if it exists in the way that it appears or not. When you analyze phenomena other than the self, the process of analysis is the same, but of course the basis is different. The first step is always to see how the phenomenon appears, which is truly existent or independent, and then one investigates to see if it exists in the way that it appears or not. And here His Holiness presented a technique where in the meditation you start with the recognition that ourselves, like all sentient beings, want to experience happiness, in particular, lasting stable happiness, a happiness that's freed from pain and misery. So this self that wants to experience happiness, this motivation behind all that we do, how does it appear to us? And it appears as independent. Then we seek it out. If the self is independent, it has no relation or connection to the body or the mind. As we saw, if the self, and therefore happiness, the happiness we long for, had no relationship to the body, then eating delicious food, having warm clothing in cold weather and so forth, would have no impact on happiness. Similarly, having a good personality, peace of mind, would have no impact on the experience of happiness by the self, because the self, if that would be if the self existed in the way that it appears. And we readily recognize the self does not exist in this way. And we can seek further in the body and in the various body parts, in the body as a whole, as well as in the various consciousnesses, as well as the entire continuum, and recognize that no matter how strongly we identify with our body, or with our personality, or with our minds, no self can be found within these, nor unrelated. Therefore, we recognize the self is empty of true existence. But that doesn't mean the self doesn't exist at all. The self is, or the person is, imputed onto the body, onto the various consciousnesses. And therefore, because the self exists in this way, not in the way that it appears as truly existent, but as imputation by mind, then the mind and the body has an impact on the experience of happiness. These causes and these favorable circumstances mentioned here, we do require these in order to experience happiness, because they do have an effect. They can and do have an effect. And therefore, we need to strive to accumulate causes for happiness. So thank you. We'll finish there for this week. And as this is an online class, if you have questions, then please email Andy. And then in our next class, whether it's in person or again online, then I'll reply to your questions. So thank you very much.